The Black Panther of Sivanipalli by Kenneth Anderson. Sivanipalli has always been a favorite haunt of mine because of its proximity to Bangalore and the fact that it lends itself so conveniently to a weekend excursion or even a visit of a few hours on a moonlit night. All you have to do is to motor from Bangalore to Kanikota, a distance of 41 miles, proceed another 4 miles by car, and then leave the car and walk along a footpath for 5 miles, which brings you to Sivanipalli. The hamlet itself stands at the edge of the reserved forest. Nearly 3 miles to the west of this small hamlet, the land drops for about 300 feet down to a stream running along the decline. To the south of the hamlet, another stream flows from east to west, descending rapidly in a number of cascades to converge with the first stream that runs along the foot of the western valley. To the east of Sivanipalli hamlet, the jungle stretches to a forest lodge, Gulhati bungalow, situated nearly 500 feet up on a hillside. East of Gulhati itself, and about 4.5 miles away as the crow flies, is another forest bungalow at a place called Ayur. 4 miles northeast again is a forestry department shed located near a rocky hill named Kuchavadi. This is a sandalwood area, and the shed houses an ancient and huge pair of scales, which are used for weighing the cut pieces of sandalwood as they are brought in from the jungle, before being dispatched to the forestry department's godowns at the block headquarters at Kanikota. Northwards of Sivanipalli, thick scrub jungle extends right up to and beyond the road, 5 miles away, where you have to leave the car before setting out for the hamlet on foot. Sivanipalli itself consists of barely half a dozen thatched huts and is hardly big enough to be called even a hamlet. A considerably larger village named Salivaram is found 3 miles to the north, just a little more than halfway along the footpath leading to the main road. Fire lines of the forestry department surround Sivanipalli on all 4 sides, demarcating the commencement of the surrounding reserved forest at distances varying from half a mile to a mile from the hamlet. There is a water hole almost at the point where 2 of these fire lines converge at the southeastern corner. The 2 streams that meet west of the village at the foot of the 300-foot drop wind on through heavy jungle in the direction of another larger village named Anchetti, about 8 miles southwestward of Sivanipalli itself. I have given this rather detailed description of the topography of the surrounding region to enable you to have in mind a picture of the area in which occurred the adventure I am about to relate. It is an ideal locality for a panther's activities, with small rocky hills in all directions, scrub jungle, heavy forest, and 2 streams, apart from the water hole, to ensure a steady water supply, not only for the panthers themselves, but for the game on which they prey. Because of this regular supply of water, a fairly large herd of cattle is quartered at Sivanipalli, which is an added attraction, of course, as far as these felines are concerned. As a result, quite a number of panthers are more or less in permanent residence around the area, and that is the main reason why I was attracted to Sivanipalli the first day I visited it in 1929. The jungle varies in type from the heavy bamboo that grows in the vicinity of the waterhole to thick forest on the southern and western sides, with much thinner jungle and scrub interspersed with sandalwood trees to the east and north. The countryside itself is extremely beautiful, with a lovely view of hills stretching away to a hazy and serrated blue line on the western horizon. Banks of mist float up from the jungle early in the morning and completely hide the base of these hills, exposing their tops like rugged islands in a sea of fleecy wool. On a cloudy day, the opposite effect is seen, for when storm clouds settle themselves along the tops of the hills, entirely hiding them from view, only the lower portions of their slopes are visible, giving the impression of almost flat country. I have spent many a moonlit night ghooming, derived from the Urdu verb ghoom, meaning to wander about, the jungles around little Sivanipalli. They hold game of every description, with the exception of bison in moderate numbers. There is always the chance of encountering an elephant, hearing the soughing moan of a tiger, the grating sawing of a panther, or the crash of an alarmed sambar as it flees at your approach, while you wander about the moonlit forest. You will not be able to see them, except perhaps the elephant, for both species of carnivora and the sambar as well are far too cunning and have long ago seen or heard you coming. You may stumble upon a bear digging vigorously in the ground for white ants or tuber roots, or sniffing and snuffling loudly as he ambles along. You will undoubtedly hear him long before you see him as a black blob in the confused and hazy background of vegetation, looking grey and ghostly in the moonlight. As far back as 1934, Sivanipalli sprang a surprise. A black panther had been seen drinking at the waterhole by a herdsman returning with his cattle from the forest, where he had taken them for the day to graze. It was shortly after 5 o'clock in the evening, which is the usual time for the cattle to be driven back to the pens in the village to be kraaled for the night. It is the custom to drive them out in the mornings to the jungle for the day's grazing at about 9 o'clock or even later, and to bring them back fairly early in the evening, the apparently late exodus and early return being to allow time for the cows to be milked twice a day. Thus, it was only a little after 5 and still quite light when the herdsman saw this black panther standing beside a bush that grew close to the water's edge, calmly lapping from the pool. He swore that it was jet black, and I had no reason to disbelieve him, for there seemed no real point in a deliberate lie. When the herd approached, the panther had gazed up at the cattle, but when the herdsman appeared amidst his beasts, it just melted away into the undergrowth. Now, the black panther is not a separate or special species. It is simply an instance of melanism. A black cub sometimes, but very rarely, appears in a litter, the other cubs being of normal size and color. Black panthers are said to occur more in the thick evergreen forests of Malaya, Burma, Assam, and similar localities than around this district. They have also been seen and shot very occasionally in the western Ghats of India. I have every reason to believe in the view that they prevail in these heavy evergreen forests, for then their dark color would afford considerably better concealment. At the same time, as they are simple instances of melanism, they should occur anywhere and everywhere that panthers exist, regardless of the type of jungle prevailing. But such has most definitely not been my own experience. I have only seen one other black panther in its wild state, and that was when it leapt across the road on the Ghat section between Penagram and Muttur near the Kaveri River at about 6 one evening. They are one of nature's, or rather the jungle's, mysteries that has never been quite satisfactorily solved. If you look closely at a black panther in a zoo, you will discover that the rosette markings of the normal panther are still visible through the black hair, although of course they cannot be seen very distinctly. When the herdsman saw this black panther, he came to the village and told the people all about it. A black panther had never before been seen or heard of in this area, and his tale was generally disbelieved. Having seen the animal with his own eyes, of course he had no doubts, although he sincerely believed that it had not been a normal or a living animal he had laid eyes upon, but Satan, in just one of the numerous forms he often adopts in the jungle to frighten poor villagers like himself. Some weeks passed, and no one saw or heard of the black panther again. The herdsman's story was forgotten. One day, some months later, in mid-afternoon, with the sun shining brightly overhead, another herd of cattle was taking its siesta, squatting with closed eyes or lazily munching the grass in the shade of neighboring trees. The beasts lay in little groups of 2 to half a dozen. The 2 herdsmen had finished their midday meal of ragi balls and curry, which they had brought along with them tied up in a dirty piece of cloth, and were fast asleep, lying side by side in the shade of another tree. It was indeed a peaceful scene, as from an azure sky the tropical sun sent down its fiery rays that were reflected from the earth in waves of shimmering heat. The herd of cattle was relaxed, drowsy, and unwatchful when the Black Panther of Sivanipalli took its first toll. Appearing unexpectedly, the panther fastened his fangs in the throat of a half-grown brown and white cow, but not before she had time to bellow with pain and leap to her feet, lifting her assailant off the ground with his teeth locked in her throat. The cow's agonized cry awakened one of the sleeping herdsmen, who was astounded by what he saw. He awoke his companion to look upon the devil himself in an unexpected black form, and they watched as the stricken cow dropped to earth to ebb out her life, kicking wildly. The Black Panther maintained his grip, and thus the cow died. The men had leapt to their feet. Ordinarily, in the event of an attack by a panther on one of their cattle, they would have rushed to its rescue, brandishing their staves and shouting at the tops of their voices, if not actually to save the life of the victim, but at least to drive off the attacker before he could drag away the kill. But in this case, neither of them found the nerve to do so. They just stood rooted to the spot and gazed in astonishment. As they did so, the panther released his hold on the throat of the dead cow and looked in their direction. Although he was some 50 yards away, they could clearly see the crimson blood gushing from the cow's torn throat and dyeing the muzzle of the panther a deep scarlet against the black background of fur. They turned tail and fled. When the few villagers of Sivanipalli heard this account, they were very reluctant to go out and bring back the carcass before it was wholly eaten. This they would most certainly have done had the killer been a normal panther, but the presence of this unheard-of black monstrosity completely unnerved them. They had been told of a panther described as being jet black by the herdsmen who had first seen him at the waterhole. Being villagers themselves, they had allowed a wide margin for exaggeration in that case, but here were two more herdsmen, both saying the same thing. Could it be really true? After that day, the black marauder began to exact a regular toll of animals from Sivanipalli. He was seen on several occasions, so that there was no more doubt in the minds of any of the villagers as to his actual existence and color. When the people came to know of his presence in the jungle, forcibly brought home to them by these frequent attacks on their animals, even their usual lethargy and apathy was shaken, and they became more and more careful. Eventually, a stage was reached when the cattle were not driven out to graze beyond a radius of about 1/4 of a mile from the village. Finding that his food supply was being cut off, the Black Panther started to extend his field of operation. He killed and ate animals that belonged to herds coming from Ancheti to the southwest and from Gulhati and Ayur to the east. He even carried off a large donkey from Salivaram, which, as I have said, lay to the north of Sivanipalli and well outside of the forest reserve proper. Just about this time, I happened to pay a visit to Sivanipalli, accompanied by a friend. We had gone there after lunch on a Sunday, intending to take an evening stroll in the forest and perhaps get a jungle fowl or a couple of green pigeon for the pot. The story of the advent and activities of the Black Panther greatly interested me. I had only once before seen one of its kind outside a zoo, and I was therefore determined to bag this specimen if possible. I offered to pay the villagers the price of the next animal killed by this panther if they would leave it undisturbed and inform me. They must go by bus to the small town of Hosur Cattle Farm, which was the closest place to a telegraph office, where a message could be sent to me at Bangalore. I also asked them to spread the same information to all persons living at places where the panther had already struck. And finally, as a further incentive and attraction, I said that I would not only pay for the dead animal, but give a cash bakshish or tip of 50 rupees to him who carried out my instructions carefully. Anticipating a call within the next few days, I kept my portable charpai machan and other equipment ready at Bangalore to leave within a few minutes of receiving the telegram. But it was over a fortnight before that call eventually came. Moreover, it arrived late. That is to say, it reached me just before 4 o'clock in the evening. I was on my way by 4:15, but it was about 7:15 and quite dark by the time I reached Sivanipalli. I noticed that the telegram had been handed in at Hosur Cattle Farm at about 1:30 that afternoon, which was far too late, apart from the additional delay that had taken place at the Bangalore end because it had been classed as an ordinary message instead of an express telegram as I had specified. There was a man named Rangaswamy living at Sivanipalli who had assisted me as shikari on 2 or 3 previous occasions, and it was this man who had sent the telegram from Hosur Cattle Farm to say that the Panther had made a kill at about 10 that very morning, shortly after the cattle had left the village for grazing. The herdsman in charge of the cattle, who, like the rest, had been told of my offer to pay for the animal that had been killed, with a cash bonus as well, had very wisely not touched the carcass, but had run back to Sivanipalli with the news which he had given to Rangaswamy, who in turn had made a great effort to reach Denkanikota in time to catch the 12:15 bus. This he had just managed to do, reaching the Hosur Cattle Farm telegraph office by 1 o'clock. Commending Rangaswamy and the herdsmen for their prompt action in sending me the news, I now had to decide between trying to stalk the Panther on his kill with the aid of torchlight or waiting at Sivanipalli until the following evening to sit up for him. The former plan was a complete gamble, as there was no certainty whatsoever that the Panther would be on the kill or anywhere near it when I got there. At the same time, I could not find any very convincing excuse to justify spending the next 24 hours cooped up in the hamlet doing nothing. I inquired where the kill had taken place, and was informed that it was hardly half a mile to the west of the village, where the land began its steep descent to the bed of the stream about 3 miles away. It seemed too temptingly close, and this decided me to tell Rangaswamy and the herdsmen that I would endeavor to bag the Panther that very night while he was eating the kill, if they would only lead me to a 1/4 of a mile from the spot and indicate the direction in which the kill lay. I felt I could trust my own sense of hearing and judgment to guide me from there on. They were both against this plan, and very strongly advocated waiting till the following evening, but I said that I would like to try it anyhow. By the time all this talk was finished, it was 10 minutes to 8, and there was no time to be lost, as the Panther would probably be eating at that very moment. I clamped my 3-cell fixed-focus electric torch, which was painted black to render it inconspicuous, to my rifle, and dropped 3 spare cells into my pocket, together with 5 spare rounds of ammunition. 4 more rounds I loaded into the rifle, keeping 3 in the magazine and 1 in the breech. Although the .405 Winchester is designed to carry 4 rounds in the magazine and 1 up the spout, I always load 1 less in the magazine to prevent a jam, which may occur should the underlever be worked very fast in reloading. Lastly, I changed the boots I had been wearing for a pair of light rubber-soled brown Ked shoes. These would, to a great extent, help me to tread lightly and soundlessly. I was wearing khaki pants and shirt at the time, and I changed into the black shirt I generally wear when sitting up in a machan. Rangaswamy and the herdsman came along with me up to a dry rivulet. Then the latter told me that this rivulet ran almost directly westwards with just 2 bends in its course to the spot where the Panther had killed. He said that the dead cow had later been dragged about 200 yards inside the jungle, roughly northwards of the place where the rivulet completed the 2nd bend. Their instructions were clear enough, and I was grateful for the 2 bends in the stream which enabled them to be so specific. Telling the men to go back, as I would eventually be able to find my own way to Sivanipalli, I started out on my own attempt. I considered that the wisest and most silent approach would be along the bed of this dry stream rather than along the top of either of its banks. Any slight sounds I might inadvertently make would then be muffled and less audible to the panther. Secondly, by walking along the bed of the stream, I could easily follow its course without having to shine my torch to see where I was going, which I might have to do if I were to walk along the bank where the vegetation would impede me, the more so because it was very dark indeed, and the sky very overcast, the clouds completely hiding the stars and whatever pale light they might have cast. Accordingly, I moved forward very carefully and soon felt the stream making its first curve, which was in a southwesterly direction. After a while, the stream started to turn northwards again, and then straightened out to resume its westerly course. I had passed the first of the two bends the herdsman had mentioned. Not long afterwards, it curved into its second bend, but this time in a northerly direction. I moved as carefully as possible to avoid tripping upon any loose stone or boulder that might make a noise. Although from the information I had been given, I knew the kill was still about 300 yards away. But panthers have very acute hearing, and if my quarry were anywhere in the immediate vicinity, if not actually eating on the kill, he would hear me and as like as not make off again. Fortunately, the rivulet was more or less clear of boulders and bushes along this part of its course, and this helped me to edge along silently. A little later, it had completed its northward turn, and it began to curve southwards. After a few yards, it straightened out once more and resumed its main westerly direction. I halted. I had reached the place at which the panther had killed the cow, and from where he had dragged the kill into the jungle for about 200 yards to the north. I knew that I must now leave the rivulet and strike off into the undergrowth to try and locate the carcass and the killer, whom I hoped to surprise in the act of eating. In the deep gloom, I had only my sense of hearing to guide me. I tiptoed towards the northern bank of the stream, which was at this spot only breast high. With my feet still on the sandy bed, I gently laid the rifle on the bank, and folding my arms across my chest, I leaned against it, listening intently. 5 minutes passed, but there was no sound of any kind to disturb the silence. Perhaps the kill was too far away to allow me to hear the panther eating. That is, if he was on the kill and if he was eating. Putting my weight on my hands, I gently drew myself up to the top of the bank, making no sound as I did so. I then picked up the rifle and started to move forward very, very slowly. The darkness was intense. At the same time, I knew I had really little, if anything, to fear from the panther should he discover me, as he was not a man-eater and had shown no inclination at any time to molest human beings. Nevertheless, this was my first experience with a black panther, and I had heard several of the usual stories about them being exceptionally dangerous and aggressive. This made me quite nervous, I can honestly tell you. Inching forward, I stopped every few yards to listen for sounds that would indicate that the panther was busy eating. Only they could guide me, as it was hopeless to expect to see anything without the aid of my torch, which could only be used when I was close enough to fire. The slightest flicker of the beam now would drive the panther away should he happen to see the light. I went along in this fashion, taking what seemed an interminable time. Perhaps I had progressed 75 yards or more when, during one of the many stops I made to listen, I thought I heard a faint sound coming from in front and a little to the right. I listened again for some time, but it was not repeated. Bushes and trees were now growing thickly around me, and my body, in pushing through the undergrowth, was making some noise in spite of the utmost care I was taking to prevent this. So were my feet as I put them down at each tread. I tried pushing them forward by just raising them off the ground and sliding them along, but I was still not altogether silent. I did this not only to try and eliminate noise, but to disguise my human footfalls should the panther hear me. He would certainly not associate any sliding and slithering sounds with a human being, but ascribe them to some small nocturnal creature moving about in the grass and bushes, whereas the sound of an ordinary footfall would immediately convey the fact that there was a man in the vicinity. An uncomfortable thought came into my mind that I might tread on a poisonous snake in the dark, and the rubber shoes I was wearing did not protect my ankles. I dispelled that thought and tried walking around the bushes and shrubs that arose before me. This caused me to deviate to some extent from the northerly course towards the dead cow I had been instructed to follow. I stopped every now and then to listen, but the sound I had last heard was not repeated. It was some time later that I concluded that I had far exceeded the distance of 200 yards from the rivulet at which the kill was said to be lying, and also that I had hopelessly lost all sense of direction, enveloped as I was amongst the trees and shrub under an overcast sky. Then suddenly I heard the sound I had so long been hoping to hear, the unmistakable sound of tearing flesh and crunching bones. I had been lucky indeed. The panther was on his kill at that moment, and what was more, was actually engrossed in feeding. Now, all I had to do was to try to creep sufficiently close to enable me to switch on my torch and take a shot. But that was all very well in theory. The idea was far easier than its execution. To begin with, the sounds did not come from the direction in which I was moving, but to my left and some distance behind me, indicating that I had not steered a straight course in the darkness. I had veered to the right, bypassing the kill. Perhaps the reason I had not heard the sound of feeding earlier was because the panther had only just returned. Or, and it was a most discomforting thought that came into my mind, maybe he had heard me in the darkness as I passed and deliberately stayed quiet. I paused for a few moments and listened so as to make quite sure of the direction from which the sounds were coming. In the darkness, I guessed the panther to be anything from 50 to 100 yards away. I now started to slide my feet forward very slowly and very cautiously towards the noise. If the panther had dragged his kill into or behind a bush, it would be impossible for me to get the shot I hoped for. On the other hand, all the advantages would be with the panther were I to fire and wound him, and if he attacked, the proposition was altogether a most unpleasant one. At the same time, I tried to encourage myself by remembering that this panther had never before molested a human being, and that the light from my torch, when eventually I flashed it, would fill him with fear and keep him from attacking me, if it did not drive the animal off entirely. It is difficult to describe truthfully the minutes that ensued, or to recount what I actually did. My mind and senses were so alert and intense that I negotiated all obstacles in the way of trees and undergrowth automatically. I knew that as long as I could hear the sounds made by the panther as he feasted, I could be certain that he was fully engaged on the task at hand and was unaware of my approach. It was only when these sounds ceased that I would have to look out, for then the panther had heard me and had stopped his feeding to listen. The sounds continued, and so did I, creeping forward cautiously, never putting my foot down till I had tested each step with my toe. When I heard or sensed a leaf rustle beneath me, I groped for a place where I could tread more silently. All the while, I kept my eyes strained upon the darkness before me, and my ears pricked for the sounds of feeding. Then suddenly, those sounds stopped, and an absolute, awful silence engulfed me. Had the panther stopped eating for a while of his own accord, or had he finished and gone away? Was he just going away? Or had he heard my stealthy approach and was even at that moment preparing to attack? The alternatives raced through my mind, and I came to a halt too. I remained thus, silent and stationary, for some time. Just how long, I have no idea, but I remember that I was thinking what I should do next. To move forward, now that he had stopped eating, would certainly betray my approach to the panther. That is, if he was not already aware of my presence. However careful I might be, it would be impossible for a human being to move silently enough in the darkness to be inaudible to the acute hearing of such an animal. On the other hand, if I stayed put and kept quiet, there was a chance that I might hear the panther should he approach, although panthers are well known to move noiselessly. Of the two courses of action, I decided on the latter, so just stood still. As events were shortly to prove, it was lucky that I did so. For a few moments later, a very faint rustling came to my straining ears. It stopped and then began again. Something was moving in the darkness before me, but that something might have been anything. It was a continuous sort of noise, such as a snake would make as it slithered through the grass and undergrowth. But a panther could just as easily cause it by creeping towards me on his belly. I can assure you that it was a very frightening thought. One thing was certain. The sound did not come from a rat or a frog or some small jungle creature or a night bird. Had such been the case, the faint noise would have been in fits and starts, in jerks, as it were, each time the creature moved. But this was a continuous sort of noise, a steady slithering or creeping forward, indicating slow but continuous progress. It was now certain beyond all doubt that the sound was being made by one of two things, a snake or the panther. I have taken some time in trying to describe to you my innermost thoughts as they raced through my mind. In actual fact, they raced through so fast that I had made up my mind within a few seconds of hearing that ominous, stealthy, creeping approach. Another few seconds longer, and I had decided that the panther was certainly creeping towards me. But as long as I could hear him, I knew I was safe from any attack. Then, abruptly, the noise ceased. Next came the well-known hissing sound, comparable with that made by an angry cobra when it exhales the air from its body in a sudden puff. The panther was beginning to snarl. Very shortly he would snarl audibly, probably growl, and then would come the charge. I had heard the same sequence of noises often enough before and knew what to expect. Quickly raising the rifle to my shoulder, I pressed the switch of the torch. Two baleful, reddish-white eyes stared back at me, but I could make out nothing of the animal itself till I remembered I was dealing with a black panther, which would be practically invisible at night. Perhaps it had at first no vicious intentions in approaching me, but had just sneaked forward to investigate what it had heard moving about in the vicinity of its kill. But having identified the source as a hated human being, that hissing start to the snarl showed that the black panther had definitely decided to be aggressive. His eyes stared back at the light of my torch without wavering. I had plenty of time in which to take careful aim, and then I fired. Instead of collapsing as I hoped and expected, or at least biting and struggling in its death throes, the panther sprang away with a series of guttural roars. Had I missed entirely, or had I wounded the beast? I felt certain that I could not have missed, but that was a question that could only be settled by daylight. I turned to retrace my steps. This time, of course, I was free to use my torch, and with its aid I walked back roughly in the direction I had come. I had thought wrong, however, and floundered about for half an hour without being able to regain the rivulet up which I had approached. I looked at the sky. It was still cloudy, and I could not pick out a single star that would help set me, even roughly, in the right direction to Sivanipalli village. Then I remembered that the land sloped gently westwards from a hamlet towards the ravine formed by the two rivers to the west. Therefore, if I walked in a direction that led slightly uphill, I could not go wrong, and would surely come out somewhere near the village. I started walking uphill, but I did not reach Sivanipalli or anywhere near it. To cut a long story short, it was past 11:30 that night when I landed, not at Sivanipalli or its precincts as I had expected, but more than halfway up the track leading northwards to Salivaram. After that, of course, I knew where I was, and within half an hour had reached the village. There I awoke Rangaswamy and related what had happened. There was nothing more to do then than bed down for the night. I have told you already that Sivanipalli was a small place boasting scarcely half a dozen huts. Rangaswamy himself was a much married man, with a large household of women and children, and I could not expect him to invite me into his hut. So I lay down in a hayrick that stood a little off the main path and pulled the straw, already damp with dew, over me to try and keep warm. If you should ever wish to undergo the lively experience of being half-eaten alive by the tiny grass ticks that abound in and around forest areas in southern India, I would recommend you to spend a night in a hayrick at Sivanipalli. You will assuredly not be disappointed. The grass tick is a minute creature, which is normally no larger than the head of a pin. After it has gorged itself on your blood, it becomes considerably larger. But it is a most ungrateful feeder. Not only does it suck your blood, but it leaves a tiny wound which rapidly develops into a suppurating sore. This increases in size in direct proportion to the amount of scratching you do to appease the intolerable itch, and eventually turns into quite a nasty sore with a brown crust-like scab and a watery interior. Moreover, should many of these creatures favor you with their attention at the same time, you will surely get a fever in addition to the sores. I hardly slept at all during the rest of that confounded night, but spent the remaining hours of darkness scratching myself all over. Dawn found me a very tired, a very disgruntled, and a very sore individual, who had most certainly had the worst of that night's encounter with the enemy. In this case, the almost microscopical little grass tick. The first thing to do, obviously, was to make some hot tea to raise my morale, which was at decidedly low ebb, and with that in view, I went to Rangaswamy's hut, only to find the door closed fast. It was evident that the inmates intended making a late morning. This did not fit in with my plans at all, so I pounded on the solid wooden structure and called aloud repeatedly. After quite a time, I heard sounds of movement from within. Eventually, the wooden bar that fastened the door on the inside was withdrawn, and a very tousled-headed, sleepy Rangaswamy emerged. I instructed him to light a fire, which he started to do on the opposite side of the village road by placing 3 stones on the ground at the 3 points of a triangle, and in the middle making a smoky fire with damp sticks and straw. I had not brought any receptacle with me for boiling water, so I had to borrow one of his household earthenware pots, which he assured me was absolutely clean, a statement which I myself was not quite prepared to believe from its appearance. However, the water eventually boiled. I had put some tea leaves into my water bottle after emptying it of its contents, poured in the boiling water, recorked it, and shook it in lieu of stirring. In the meantime, the inmates of the other huts had come to life. They watched me interestedly. Some offered a little milk, and someone else contributed some jaggery or brown sugar, for which I was very grateful, having also forgotten to bring sugar. We boiled the milk and put some lumps of jaggery into my mug, adding tea and boiling milk. Believe it or not, it brewed a mixture that did have some resemblance to tea. Breakfast consisted of some eggs which I purchased and hard-boiled over the same fire. By about 7, I had restored enough interest in myself and events, after my dreadful encounter of the previous night with those obnoxious little ticks, to think of doing something about the panther. I asked Rangaswamy to get the herdsman who had accompanied us the previous night, and who had not put in an appearance so far that morning, or one of his companions, to collect a herd of buffaloes, if they were obtainable, and drive them into the thick undergrowth to dislodge the panther, as I felt confident I had not missed the brute entirely with my one shot. All present answered that there were no buffaloes in Sivanipalli, and no one was willing to risk his cattle being injured in a possible encounter with the panther. Just then, my missing companion of the night before, the herdsman who had accompanied me, turned up. He said that he had a friend at Salivaram who owned a muzzle-loading gun. He had wanted to borrow the gun so as to come along and assist me, and with that in view, he had set out to Salivaram early that morning while it was still dark. Unfortunately, his friend was away with his gun, and so he had been unable to borrow it. He had returned empty-handed. I thanked him for his thoughtful intention to assist me, but inwardly I am more than thankful that he had been unsuccessful in borrowing the muzzle-loader. With an inexperienced user, a muzzle-loader can become a mighty, deadly weapon, and I confess I would have felt most nervous with him and that gun behind me. Having failed to obtain the use of buffaloes, I then tried to enlist the cooperation of the owners of such village curs as there were at Sivanipalli. After some humming and hawing, one solitary cur was produced. She was a lanky female, with ears cut off at their base, entirely brown in color, with a tremendously long curved tail. The typical example of a village pariah dog, as they are called, whose ears had been amputated when a puppy because of the ticks which would in later life have become lodged on and inside them. With villagers, it is a simple process of reasoning to come to the conclusion that it takes less effort and far less time to cut off the ears of their dogs when they are puppies than periodically to remove scores of ticks in later life. By a strange coincidence, this female was named Kush, which reminded me of the name of the dog Kush Kush Kariya, owned by my old friend of jungle days, Baira the Pujari. I don't know if this name is a favorite among the dog owners of the forest areas of Salem district, or whether it just lends itself to a natural sound emitted to attract the attention of any dog. Personally, I am inclined to the latter idea. Whatever it may be, I did not know then that this female, Kush, would conduct herself every bit as precociously as her namesake, the animal owned by Baira. Finally, accompanied by Rangaswamy, the herdsman, Kush, and her owner, we set off to try and find out what had become of the panther. We retraced our steps of the night before to the spot where my companions had left me, then followed in my own footsteps along the two bends in the rivulet, and finally climbed into its northern bank at the place I had chosen the previous night. Thereafter I led the way with cocked rifle, Kush running between me and her owner, who came last in file. Between us came Rangaswamy with the herdsman behind him. As I had already discovered the night before, the undergrowth was dense, so that there was no means of tracing the exact course I had followed only 12 hours previously, nor, being daylight, was I able to pick out any of the trees or bushes I had negotiated in the darkness, although I knew roughly the direction in which I had gone. The herdsman, of course, knew where the kill lay, but I did not want to go directly to it, my idea being to find, if possible, the place where I had fired at the panther. I did not succeed. Those who have been in jungles will understand how very different in shape, size, and location just a small bush appears in daylight compared with its appearance at night. Darkness greatly magnifies the size of objects in the forest, distorts their shape, and misleads as regards to direction. To help me find what I was looking for, I got the herdsman to lead us to the dead cow, which he found without difficulty. Incidentally, it had been half eaten, although of course there was no means of knowing just then whether the panther had fed before my encounter with it or whether I had entirely missed him and he had returned to feed after I had left. Panthers sometimes return to their kill if they are missed, although such behavior, in my experience at least, is not very common. Having reached the kill, I now tried to recollect and recast the direction from which I had come, so as to try and follow my own footsteps from there and eventually come to the spot where I had fired. Unfortunately, I had no means of knowing exactly how far the panther had crept towards me, but had to rely entirely on my own judgment as to how far away he had been when I first heard him feeding. Sounds in a jungle at night, when both the hearer and the origin of the sound are enveloped by the surrounding undergrowth, can be very deceptive, and the distance they may travel is hard to guess for that very reason. I felt that to the best of my knowledge, I could have been standing anything from 15 to 50 yards from the dead cow. Deciding approximately on the distance where I might have been standing, I paced off those 15 yards and got one of the men to mark the spot by bending down a small branch. Then I paced another 35 yards to attain the maximum distance of 50 yards, which I judged would be about the greatest that could have separated me from the feeding panther I had heard the night before. Here we bent another branch. Somewhere in between these two markers, and very approximately in the same direction as I was walking, I knew I should find some sign of whether my bullet had struck the panther. If I did not find anything, then I would have to conclude that I had completely missed him. By this time, I was also sure that the panther, if he had been wounded, was not lurking anywhere in the immediate vicinity. For had that been the case, he would undoubtedly have given some sign by now, hearing us walking about and talking. That sign would have been in the form of a growl, or perhaps even a sudden charge. The absence of any such reaction and the complete silence led me to conclude that even if I had hit him, the wound was not severe enough to prevent him from getting away from the spot. I instructed my 3 companions to cast around in a circle and search carefully for a possible blood trail. I joined them, and it was not very long before Kush, sniffing at something, attracted her owner's attention. He called out that he had found what we were looking for. Gathering around him and the dog, we saw an elongated smear of dried blood on a blade of lemon grass. My spirits rose considerably. Here was proof that I had not missed. The height of the blood mark from the ground indicated that I had wounded my quarry somewhere in the upper part of his body, and as I knew I had fired between his eyes as they had reflected my torchlight, my bullet must have grazed his head. Alternatively, if he had happened to be crouching down with raised hindquarters at that time, a rather unlikely position for a panther to adopt when creeping forward, my bullet might be embedded itself somewhere in the rear part of his back. This was where Kush showed her merit. She was a totally untrained cur, but she instinctively appeared to sense what was required of her. For a little while she sniffed around wildly and at random, but then started to whine and run ahead of us. We followed and found more blood smears on leaves and blades of grass where the panther had passed. Between the bushes and clumps of high grass there were spots of blood on the ground too. This was an encouraging find, as it showed that the animal had been bleeding freely, clear evidence that the wound was not just a superficial graze. The blood itself had mostly dried, except in some very sheltered places. There it was moist enough to be rubbed off by the fingers. However, it was neither thick nor dark enough to suggest that my bullet had penetrated a vital organ, such as a lung. Kush set out very rapidly in a westerly direction, and it was quite obvious she was following a trail that would eventually bring us to the sharp decline in the land, down to the bed of the stream flowing from north to south before it joined the other stream lower down and turned westwards. This stream, before its confluence, is known as the Anekal Vanka. The combined streams are called Doda Halla, which in the Kannarese language literally means the big gorge. It has this name because so many sections flow through ravines and gorges as they twist and twine a tortuous path past the village of Anchetti. There, the river changes its course abruptly and turns southwards past Gundalam to its eventual junction with the Kaveri River. It is this same stream, the Doda Halla, that was once the haunt of the man-eating tiger of Jaudagiri, but that is another story. I have explored every section of it, right up to the place where it joins the Kaveri, and have nicknamed it the Secret River, partly because of the fact that, due to the many miles of rough walking entailed in following its course, few people come that way, and it is delightfully lonely and far away from the sight and sound of human beings. Also, because I have discovered secrets of geological interest along its banks. I hesitate to divulge them, for with their publicity must automatically follow the next necessary evil, the violation of the sanctity of one of the most delightfully isolated jungle localities in Salem district. Returning to events as they occurred that morning, the undergrowth was very dense, but to the unerring instinct of Kush, this appeared to offer no obstacle. In fact, the trouble lay in keeping up with her. Her small and lithe brown body dodged in and out between bushes and outcrops of wait-a-bit thorn. Our legs, hands, and arms were severely lacerated by these thorns because we were moving at a foolish speed in order to keep the dog in sight, taking no precautions whatever against a sudden attack by the wounded panther if he happened to lie immediately ahead of us. At times, the brambles and other obstructions slowed us down, and Kush would get far ahead and disappear. It then became necessary to whistle her back, and when she did so, which was only after some minutes, she appeared to experience some difficulty in picking up the trail again. We had no rope with us, so I borrowed the herdsman's turban and knotted one end of the cloth around Kush's neck, giving the other end to her owner. But it was a small turban and the cloth too short. The man had to stoop down to retain his hold, while Kush strained, spluttered, and coughed in her anxiety to forge ahead. In this fashion we progressed, until we eventually reached the edge of the plateau, where the land began to fall away sharply to the bed of the Anekalvanka stream, which we could see between breaks in the treetops below us, the sun glinting on the silvery surface of the water as it meandered from side to side of its sandy bed. The stream itself was 3/4 dry at that time of the year. A little later, we came across the first concrete evidence that the panther had begun to feel the effects of his wounds. He had lain down in the grass at the foot of a babool tree, and had even rolled with pain as blood was to be seen in patches and smears where he had rested and tossed. Kush spent a long time at this spot and evinced another unusual characteristic by licking at the blood. Ordinarily, a village dog is terrified of a panther, but Kush, as I have said already, was an unusual animal, and it was indeed very lucky that her owner had been willing to bring her along. Normally, villagers who will not hesitate to lop off the ears of a puppy at their base will vote that it is a cruel practice to employ a dog for tracking down a wounded panther or a tiger, and will flatly refuse to be parties to such a deed. As it was, without the invaluable aid rendered by this dog, we would never have been able to follow the blood trail as we did that morning. It would not have been visible to normal human eyesight in the heavy underbrush. As we descended the deep decline, vegetation became sparser and the ground became bare and rocky. Boulders were scattered everywhere, interspersed with tufts of the tough, long-bladed lemon grass. Then we reached a stage where there were only boulders, big and small, and the descent had almost ended. This was the high-level mark reached by the waters of the stream when in spate during the monsoon. Here, with the end of the vegetation, tracking became easy. Drops of telltale rusty brown, where blood had fallen from the wounded animal and splashed on the rocks, revealed its passage. Judging from the distance we had come and the quantity of blood that the panther had lost, it appeared to be more severely hurt than I had at first imagined. The wound must have been a deep one, and the bullet had probably struck an artery. Had it been elsewhere, particularly in some fleshy part of the animal, there was a possibility that the bleeding might have lessened, if not ceased entirely, by the natural fat under the skin coming together and closing the hole made by the bullet. We now reached the narrow bed of the stream in which the water was still flowing. Here, the panther had crouched down to drink, and there were 2 sets of blood marks, one nearer to the water's edge than the other. The marks further away indicated more bleeding than those closer. This was curious, and it puzzled me greatly at the time, considering I had fired only 1 shot the night before. The solution was an even greater surprise. At one spot, the panther had stepped into his own gore, and had left a clear pug mark on a rock just before he had waded across the stream. The mark had been made by one of the animal's 4 feet, and its size suggested a panther of only average proportions that was probably a male. The blood had been washed off the foot by the time the animal had reached the opposite bank, but the dried drops on the stones and boulders continued. After crossing the stream, the panther had changed his course and had walked parallel with the edge of the water and alongside it for nearly 200 yards. Then he had turned to the left and begun to climb the opposite incline. The stones and rocks once more gave way rapidly to vegetation, and again we negotiated thickets of long grass, thorny clumps, small scattered bamboos and trees. Up and up the panther had climbed, and so now did Kush on the trail, conducting herself as if she had been specially trained for the job. Eventually, we came to the road which leads from Denkanikota to Anchetti, and which intersects the forest on its way downwards to the latter village. We had come out on this road exactly opposite the 9th milestone, which we now saw confronting us at the roadside. Incidentally, this was the road on which I had parked my car near the 5th milestone when I had left it the evening before to walk to Sivanipalli. Many carts had traversed the road during the night and in the earlier hours of that morning, and the scent was completely lost for a moment in the powdery brown dust. But Kush had no difficulty in picking it up on the other side, and we followed behind her. The grass and bamboos gradually gave way to more thorns and more lantana, which tore at our clothing and every part of our anatomy they touched. In places where the panther had crept beneath the lantana and thorn bushes, an almost impenetrable barrier confronted us. There was no way through, and there was no way around, leaving no alternative but to follow by creeping on our bellies beneath the bushes. My rifle was an encumbrance in such places and conditions, and I cursed and swore as the thorns tore at my hair and face and became embedded in my hands, body, and legs. The plight of my 3 companions was infinitely worse, as they wore thinner and less clothing than I did. Perhaps their skins were thicker, I really don't know. But I am sure that the language that floated from all 4 of us would have won us prizes in any Billingsgate contest. Only Kush was unperturbed, and from her position ahead she kept looking back at us, clearly impatient at the slow, clumsy progress we were making. By this time, it was also evident that the wounded animal was heading for a large hill that lay about half a mile behind a hamlet named Kundukotai. This village was situated between the 7th and 8th milestones on the Denkanikota Anchetti road, which we had just crossed. The top of the hill was known to hold many caves, both large and small, and what was worse, the arched roofs of some of the larger caves had been chosen by the big jungle rock bees as safe and ideal places in which to construct their hives. I had often seen these hives as I had motored along the road to Anchetti on previous occasions. I felt that my chances of bagging the Black Panther were becoming very dim indeed. Looking for him amongst those caves would be like searching for the proverbial needle in a haystack. In addition, the panther had the bees to guard him if his place of retreat happened to be one of the many caves they had chosen for their hives. I can assure you that these rock bees, when disturbed, can be most formidable opponents. We plodded along and broke cover along the line of caves where the thorn bushes thinned out and became less numerous owing to shelves of sloping rock worn glass smooth by centuries of rainwater as it ran down from above. The scent led up and across the sloping shelf of rock to one of the larger openings that loomed above us. From where we stood, we could see the black masses of at least half a dozen beehives hanging from the roof of the cave, each about a yard long by about 2 feet wide. The remains of old abandoned hives were scattered here and there amongst them, the wax sticking out from the rock in flattish triangles of dirty yellow-white color, perhaps 9 inches long. My canvas-soled shoes enabled me to climb the slippery shelf without much difficulty, while the bare feet of my companions helped them even more. Kush's claws made a faint clicking sound as she scampered up the rock ahead of us. We reached the entrance to the cave, where a subdued, rustling sound was all-pervading. It came from the movements of millions of bees as they crawled in and about the hanging hives above us. There was also a continuous faint droning that arose from the wings of the busy insects as they flew in from the jungle with honey from the wild flowers which they would store in the hives and from those departing on a trip for more. The little creatures were absorbed in their duties and paid no attention to us, but we realized that if we happened to disturb them, these same little creatures, so unoffending and peaceful now, would pour on us in a venomous attack like a torrent of black lava and sting us to death in a matter of a few minutes. We stood before the entrance of the cave where the blood trail, very slight now, was still visible in the form of 2 tiny dried droplets. They showed that the wounded beast had gone inside. Near its mouth, the cave was comparatively large, some 20 feet across by about 20 feet high. Daylight filtered into the interior for some yards, beyond which all was darkness. I counted 9 separate beehives, all of great size, suspended from the roof of the cave close to the entrance. The floor was of rock and appeared to be free of the usual dampness associated with such places. No doubt this accounted for the cave being inhabited by the panther, and the bees too. For these animals and insects, particularly the former, dislike damp places. I whispered to my 3 companions to remain outside and to climb up the sloping rock by the sides of the entrance to a point above the cave, and on no account to go downhill, as that was the direction in which the panther would charge if he passed me. They disappeared, and Kush and I entered the cave. From that moment, Kush seemed to know there was danger ahead. Gone was her erstwhile courage, and she slunk at my heels, gradually falling behind me. I walked forward as far as I could see in the dim light that filtered in from outside. At most, this might have been for about 30 feet. Then we came to a halt. I could go no further, as, not anticipating that my quarry would enter such a cave, I had not brought my torch with me from the village. There were now 2 alternatives, either to try to arouse the wounded animal, or to return to Sivanipalli for the torch, telling the men to keep watch from their position of comparative safety above to guard against the panther slinking out before I came back. I should, of course, have followed the second course. Not only was it safer, but more sure. I suppose, really, I felt too lazy to go all that way back and return again. So I thought I would give the first plan a trial and, if possible, save myself the trouble of a long walk. I whistled and shouted loudly. Nothing happened. I shouted again. Kush, who had been whimpering, then started to bark. Still nothing happened. The cave had narrowed down to about half its dimensions at the entrance. Only silence rewarded our efforts. The deep, dark interior was as silent as the grave. Had the wounded animal died inside? This seemed unlikely, as there was no evidence that the panther had lain down again after the first rest he had taken before crossing the Anekalvanka stream. Had he left the cave before our arrival? This might easily have happened, but again there was no evidence to suggest that such was the case. I looked around for something to throw. Just one large stone lay close to my feet. I picked it up in my left hand and found it heavy. I am left-handed for throwing purposes, although I shoot from the right shoulder. I had already cocked my rifle, and balancing it in the crook of my right arm, threw the stone underarm with as much force as I could muster. It disappeared into the blackness of the cave. I heard it strike the rock floor with a dull thud, and then clatter on in a series of short bounces. The next instant, there came the all-too-familiar series of coughing roars, as the panther catapulted itself at me out of the darkness. Being a black panther, I could not see it till it emerged from the gloom 2 or 3 yards in front of my rifle. I fired, but the impetus of its charge made the panther seem to slide forward towards me. I fired again. The confines of the cave echoed and re-echoed with the 2 reports. Then all hell was let loose. The sound of the bees, which had been registering all this while almost subconsciously on my hearing as a faint humming drone, rose suddenly to a crescendo. The daylight coming in at the entrance to the cave became spotted with a myriad black darting specks, which increased in number as the volume of sound rose in intensity. The black objects hurled themselves at me. The air was alive with them. I had aroused the wrath of the bees. Gone was all thought of the panther as I whipped off my khaki jacket, threw it around my exposed back and face, and doubled for the entrance. The bees fell upon me as an avalanche. They stung my hands. They got through the folds of the jacket and stung my neck, my head, and my face. One even got down under the collar of my shirt and stung my back. The stings were horribly painful. I slid down the sloping rock up which we had climbed just a short while before. As from far away, I could hear Kush yelping in anguish. As fast as I moved, my winged tormentors moved faster. The air was thick with them as they dive-bombed me mercilessly. I remembered comparing them to Japan's suicide pilots who sacrificed their lives and their machines by literally throwing themselves upon the enemy. Similarly, each bee that stung me that day automatically sacrificed its life. For the end of every bee's sting is barbed, and in trying to extricate the point after it has stung an enemy, the insect tears out its sting with the venom sac attached. These remain embedded in the skin of the victim. Thus, in stinging, the bee does irreparable damage to itself, from the effects of which it dies very soon. I reached the foot of the sloping shelf with the bees still around me. In desperation, I crawled under the thickest lantana bush that was available. I have always cursed this shrub as a dreadful scourge to forest vegetation and a pest to man, encroaching as it always does on both jungles and fields, in addition to being an impediment to silent and comfortable movement along game trails. But at that moment I withdrew my curses and showered blessings on the lantana instead. It saved my life, for bees must attack and sting during flight, another resemblance they bear to the aforementioned dive bombers. Clever as they are, they have not the sagacity to settle down and then creep forward on their feet to a further attack. The code with them is to dive, sting, and die. The closeness of the network of lantana brambles prevented their direct path of flight onto my anatomy. And so I was delivered from what would have been certain death had the area just there been devoid of the pestiferous lantana I had so often cursed before. For no matter how fast I had run, the bees would have flown faster and descended in their thousands upon me. All the 9 hives had been thoroughly disturbed by now, and the buzzing of angry bees droned and drummed in the air above me. I lay still and silent under the protecting lantana, smarting from the many stings the creatures had inflicted on me during my flight. It took over 2 hours for the droning to subside, and for the bees to settle down to work once more. I felt very sleepy and would have dozed off were it not for the pain of the stings that kept me awake. The hot, burning sensation increased as my skin swelled around each wound. It was 3 in the afternoon before I could crawl out of the lantana and wend my way downhill to the road. From there, I walked to Kundukotai village. There I found my 3 followers. They had almost completely escaped the attention of the bees at their vantage point above the entrance to the cave. The bees had evidently concentrated their attack on the moving enemies immediately before them, myself and poor Kush, who was also with the 3 men now. She had been badly stung, and I had no doubt that the panther had also received their close attention. All of us walked to the car where I had left it the day before. After we had piled in, I set out for Denkanikota, where there was a local fund hospital and dispensary. It was quite late in the evening when we roused the doctor. He took us to his surgery in the hospital and with the aid of a pair of tweezers removed the stings embedded in Kush and myself. We had received, respectively, 19 and 41 barbs from those little demons in the cave. The doctor applied ammonia to our wounds. We spent the night in the forest bungalow at Denkanikota. The beds there are of iron with no mattresses, so I lay in an armchair. The 3 men slept on the veranda with Kush. The stings brought on an attack of ague and fever. Kush suffered too, and I could hear her whimpers. My neck, face, and hands were still swollen. One bee had succeeded in registering a sting not far from the corner of my left eye, causing it partially to close. Dawn made me look a sorry sight with my swollen eye and puffy face as I stood before the one blurred mirror the bungalow boasted. We waited till past 10 and then drove back to the 9th milestone. Retracing our steps, but this time along the cattle and game trails where walking was comparatively easy, we came to the place below the rock shelf where we had stood the day before. The bees were once again busy at their hives. All was peaceful and serene. Leaving the 3 villagers, I climbed the slope with Kush for the 2nd time and cautiously approached the cave. I knew I was safe from the bees unless I disturbed them again, and I was almost sure my 2 shots the previous day had killed the panther. Even if they had not, the bees would have completed that work. I was right. Lying a few paces in sight and curled into a ball was the black panther, dead and quite stiff. Kush stayed a yard away from it, sniffing and growling. I put my hand over her mouth to quieten her down, for fear of disturbing those dreadful bees and bringing them down upon us once more. Walking out of the cave, I beckoned to the men to come up to me. Together we hauled the panther down the slope. The herdsman, who carried a knife, then lopped off a branch to which we tied its feet with lengths of creeper vine. All 4 of us then shouldered the load and carried it to the waiting car, where I slung the dead animal between bonnet and mudguard. At the then Kanikota forest bungalow, I removed the skin. It was a male panther of normal size, measuring 6 feet 7 inches in length. The rosettes showed up distinctly under the black hairs that covered them. It was the first, and incidentally the only, black panther I have ever shot. It was difficult to detect the bee stings embedded in the black hair, but I told the men to make a careful count of the barbs they extracted, which I personally checked. There were 273 stings in that animal, confirmed by the number of barbs extracted. There must have been many more that escaped our attention. I rewarded the men for their services and returned to Bangalore, well compensated for the punishment I had received from the bees. For I had a black panther skin, which is something very uncommon, and I had a wonderfully sagacious dog, Kush, whom I purchased from her owner for 7 rupees. There is one thing I nearly forgot to mention. You will remember that I had discovered 2 separate blood marks at the spot where the panther had stopped to drink in the Anekalvanka stream. One of them had shown signs of greater bleeding than the other, and because I had fired only 1 shot, I had wondered about it at the time. The reason was now quite clear. My 1 bullet, aimed between the eyes, had missed its mark, had furrowed past the temple and ear, and embedded itself in the animal's groin. The second wound was the one that had bled severely. The first was only superficial. Evidently, the body had been slightly twisted and crouched for the spring as I had fired that night, just in time. Of the 2 shots fired in the cave, one, the first, had struck the panther in the chest, and the other, as the panther skidded towards me, had entered the open mouth and passed out at the back of the neck. The end.